Well, good evening, everyone. I want to thank you for joining in our first Book to Action. We are going to get this event started off with our introduction from Mayor Locke Dawson. Thank you. I'm going to stop sharing my screen.
Well, thank you, Joseph. I appreciate being invited tonight. And I do want to thank everybody for joining us for this kickoff event of Riverside Reads 2021. This presentation is made possible by our California Center for the Book, which is a program of the California Library Association, supported in whole or in part by the U.S. Institute of Museum and Library Services under the provisions of the Library Services and Technology Act. So this year's series is based upon Choosing Civility, a book by P.M. Forney and the City of Riverside's commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion. Riverside has demonstrated for years that we value inclusivity, and the 2020 Municipal Equality Index reflects that. Our city can be proud of its unique, shall we say, proud of our unique efforts. We've got the Mayor's Multicultural Forum, we've got the Human Relations Commission, we have an inclusivity statement that guides everything we do. That's unlike any city that I know. And even the annual Carlos E. Cortez Award for Championing Diversity and Inclusivity. As defined by P.M. Forney, civility means a great deal more than just being nice to one another. Civility includes courtesy, politeness, mutual respect, and fairness, and taking an active interest in the well-being of our community and concern for the health of our society. Tonight's discussion of inclusive cultural competence will be led by Miriam Lamb. Professor Lamb was president and a longtime board member of the Riverside Asian American Community Association and has served on the boards of Third Way Human Rights and Development, Vietnamese American Arts and Letters Association, and the Global Village Foundation, among many others. She earned a bachelor's degree in English and a master's and PhD degrees in comparative literature with certificates of emphasis in feminist studies and Asian American studies from UC Irvine. In her role as the UCR Vice Chancellor and Chief Diversity Officer, Dr. Lamb advises the leadership team, including the Chancellor, on all issues related to diversity, equity, and inclusion, and sets the vision and course for positioning UCR as a national leader in reimagining diversity in higher education. She has a wide range of initiatives there that address DEI, partners with campus and community stakeholders to advance UCR's diversity mission, and represents UCR at the system, state, and national levels. So, without further ado, it is with great pleasure that I introduce to you our guest speaker, Dr. Miriam Lamb. Dr. Lamb.
Thank you so much, Mayor Locke Dawson, for the introduction, for joining us. And thank you also to Joseph, Nancy, Scott, and Aaron at the Riverside Public Libraries for inviting me to participate and kick off in the book program. It's exciting, and I love that you're being very comprehensive in terms of prepping our community for the conversation about civility and about the book itself. Because I think civility, and there's something called civility politics and respectability politics that you may have heard criticized in recent years as a way to actually silence dissent or protest by saying, oh, well, you're not being professional, or oh, you're not being civil or respectable, right? And sometimes the definitions of civility can be ambivalent, and they can be rolled out and projected in uneven, inequitable ways. And so I think what they asked me to do today was to give you a kind of general overview of the language we might need to have these difficult conversations. around civility, around social justice, around diversity, equity, inclusion. And so today is meant to be very interactive. I'm going to go through a lot of slides and a few brief videos that I've embedded, but feel free to jump in and write questions in the Q&A function at the in the Zoom function, and Joseph and Nancy will field those questions and unmute themselves and ask as we're going. So don't feel like you have to wait till the end for Q&A. It'll be very interactive. I see Aaron's thanking Mayor Locke Dawson. And thank you all to the folks who have turned out, all the participants. I recognize some familiar names in the participants list. So I am going to, before I share my screen, when we facilitate difficult conversations on campus, we often like to start with establishing some common ground rules so that we can ensure a safe or brave space for everyone participating. It's important to recognize that these kinds of difficult conversations are happening across the country as well as our city and state, and they're not meant to in any way be a debate or a punitive in any way, but really instead a kind of earnest engagement with one another to create a more cohesive community, even with all of our complex differences. And so it's important to recognize that there may be power dynamics in the room among participants, among facilitators, and that we should try to, when possible, avoid accusatory language, avoid defensiveness, try to pretend you're in couples counseling, marriage counseling, and make I statements instead of you statements. And of course, you have the right to pass on any interactive questions we might pose, and know that it's fine to feel confused, embarrassed, or not to have the answers to everything, and that it's unrealistic to disagree with others, but expect them to agree with you. And also try to avoid generalizing how others should feel or comport or behave based on how you might behave or comport, because we all have very different experiences and backgrounds and ideological positions and varying forms of privilege and disadvantage that might prevent us from acting in the same way. So that's it of my ground rules. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And the other reason Joseph and Nancy are fielding the Q&A for me is that when I share my screen, I can't open my chat without everyone else seeing it as well. And then, oops, can you still see my screen? Oh no, I chose the wrong one. Oh, there you go. Okay, can you still hear me all right?
Yes,
Yes.
and we can see your screen.
Thank you, excellent. So I thought we would start with just some basics around notions of diversity and inclusivity, right? You see with the iconography on the right, that very much our K through 12 teachers feel like they're on the front lines of civility and diversity work, because, you know, children come to the school, they come to K through 12 in playgrounds, saying things that might be very hurtful and harmful to one another, not really understanding what they're saying might be that damaging, right? We all inherit language and jokes and assumptions from our families and social contexts. And so often K through 12 teachers feel like they're on the front lines of this kind of inclusivity work, right? And likewise, corporations across, and small businesses and industries across our town and community have chief diversity officers employed because they know they have very diverse workforces that need to communicate with one another respectfully and to work well with one another. And so often CDOs or chief diversity officers in corporations work on everything from recruitment so that there's good proportional representational diversity amongst the employees, but also to help coach, workshop, facilitate what has come to be called cultural competency training and workshops, right? On our campus, we prefer the notion of cultural humility instead of cultural competency, because competency sort of assumes there's some promised land you get to where you're wonderful and have all kinds of competency and can talk on anything without stepping in it, right? Which we all know we make mistakes and can say inappropriate things. And so we prefer a notion of cultural humility, recognizing that we can always learn and do better, be better. We don't know it all about every single cultural group and identity category. And we find that remaining humble and that space of humility is very helpful in being better listeners and continuing to self-educate around all these very difficult topics. And I'm taking this from our UC, University of California Regents policy. But for us, diversity has come to mean sort of everything and nothing at once, right? It's sort of like a Seinfeld episode where people have come to use it as just a head count, oh, how many heads of every racial, food group, and gender do you have in your unit or in your department? And it's often because these are the federal statistics that we're able to collect to check on parity and representation. But diversity at its core has a much larger goal in that it's about representing a variety of personal experiences, socioeconomic backgrounds, abilities and disabilities, right? Language abilities, gender identities and such, and that the goal of diversity work is really to prepare our community, right? Individual staff, faculty, students, community members, to better and more effectively interact with one another so that we can all interact well in an increasingly complex and pluralistic society. And this notion of inclusive excellence, which you may have heard the Prime Minister of Canada using quite a bit as he was a K-12 teacher, but is this historically often academic institutions used research excellence or teaching excellence as the kind of go-to gold standard. And then, oh, if we have time, if we have money, if we have resources, we'll think about diversity work, right? And there's this arbitrary division of the two when scholarship now shows us that we're not actually going to have research excellence or teaching excellence without a lot of diversity already embedded in that space, so that you do have diverse experiences and innovations and creativities and problem solution solving, right? Contributing to that. And then the equity part of diversity, equity, inclusion is also something folks don't always wrap their heads around. And you've probably seen the first two images on the left quite a bit. We hear all these phrases like, oh, I don't see race, I don't see color. Everybody just needs to pull themselves up by their bootstraps and work hard, and that's equality, right? But we all know we don't start off on the level playing field. And if we treated everyone equally, that doesn't mean that everyone will have an equal chance at success, right? Because we've all heard these other historical phrases like separate but equal, and that was not exactly just or fair or equitable. And so equity work is about giving individuals and groups and folks what they might need, which may be different from one another, in order to get them at a level playing field where they might be able to succeed equally and thrive equally, right, with those who have had those advantages in the past already. And of course, even with equity work, we find that there are still systemic and institutional inequities that make it challenging for true equality, right? So we know, try as we might, often the rich get richer, the little kid is further back in the mud, right? And then often we hear discouraging language like, oh, well, those inner city kids start off behind, and oh, we have to do so much work with them. Oh, we don't have the funding for those summer bridge programs or things like that, right? And so there's this kind of treatment of these individuals as if there's something wrong with them, like there's a deficit model approach to how we help improve their lives. And that's really problematic and damaging as well, because we know it wasn't their fault. They came into these situations. They came from school districts that were under-resourced or redlined, right? They came from disadvantage to begin with. And our job is to actually rectify what we can while we have those community members in our midst, right, do what we can to kind of level that playing field. And so it's more important to recognize that there are larger systemic and institutional barriers that keep us from true equality. And so let's use this fence as an example of, say, financial barriers to higher education, for example. So you may criticize socialist countries, but they do not charge tuition for access to higher education, right? So if we removed, say, tuition for college and universities, that would be one huge financial access barrier. But that doesn't mean everything's solved, right? We still have, in this example, the industry of Major League Baseball. So they're still out in the playing fields. They couldn't afford a seat in the stands, right? We know from scholarship on Major League Baseball that certain players get recruited, certain coaches get hired. There are different races and genders involved in that. Who can afford seats in the stands? Who can afford a Dodger dog or a Coolaku, right? So we know that equity work is a never-ending process, right? There's no, oh, we did that last year. We're set. We've got diversity here. And then inclusion, people often also assume it just means including the different racial groups and gender identities and such in our midst. But you could have that. And which one of these letters do you think represents inclusion or true inclusivity? Any guesses? Anything in the Q&A, Joseph or Nancy?
Miriam, we
Yeah.
have a question, but we're getting the answer A right now.
Okay. So A, they're not in the circle yet, right? So that might not be totally inclusive yet. So assuming the circle is the space you want to be part of, the inside the circle.
Yes, and we got the answer C. We have another C.
Yeah, often people get vary between C and B, right? Because with B, the minoritized colored dots are also in the space of the circle. But you know, you could have all the racial food groups there, and they could not be comfortable. And the however you want to call them, traditional majority dominant folks are also there, but not necessarily interacting with one another. And these folks could just sit at the same cafeteria table in the lunchroom, right? And so this is a form of integration, right? Where you've integrated now diversity into your space, but people aren't really comfortable there with one another yet. And so you don't have inclusion yet, because inclusivity is about community building. It's about a sense of belonging and a comfort level where everyone in the space feels valued and accepted and supported, right? And so C is where you want to be at for inclusivity. And so the most minoritized individual in that space, the youngest trans person of color in that space should be just as comfortable saying, you know what, you keep using my wrong gender pronoun. Could you work harder at getting that right? To the, oldest, straightest, whitest male in the room, I'm, using joking shorthand, they should feel just as comfortable in that space saying, you know what, I have no idea what demisexuality is. Can you point me to a resource so I could read up on this so I don't say anything inappropriate, right? So the more communities go through these difficult conversations together, the scholarship shows that those communities are actually much stronger and more resilient, and there's better trust amongst them, and they actually will, in the long run, uplift one another and work harder and really build a strong sense of true community and inclusivity. And so that's the difference between just diversity as a numbers game, right? And a real kind of equity mindedness, which is what inclusivity is. And I think folks are recording this for other professional staff in the city to use later. So I'll definitely share my slide deck for those who would like. And this is just a recap of those definitions. Now,
Miriam, sorry, we did get a question around when you were talking removing the fence. And this one, it says, Riverside is a multicultural city with a diversified population.
Mhm.
So how are government agencies prepared, and what knowledge do they have to prevent violent or ethnic groups by others?
Yeah, that perhaps might be more of a question for Mayor Locke Dawson or the city manager, Al Zelenko, right? In terms of, I feel like that's a larger question that is not in my scope of specialization. I think that's a larger community discussion we could all have together in terms of, you heard some of what Mayor Locke Dawson was describing about all of these initiatives in terms of anti-racist statements and the mayor's multicultural forum and rewarding, with the Carlos E. Cortez Award, those in the community who are working hard with the city and with the community to engage in these interventions for our community. I don't know if Mayor Locke Dawson wants to add anything with the question.
Well, I always think, thank you, Dr. Lamb. And that is a huge question. Thank you for that question. But it's, you're right. It's a work in progress, right? I mean, I don't think any city has cracked that nut. That's why we are always doing things. We did pass our anti-racist agenda. We have an inclusivity statement that we've had in place for many years. We're constantly trying to bring, just even my own little office of mayor, I've diversified my staff from the previous administration. So, it's all these little pieces of the puzzle that fit together to a more equitable society.
Thank you. I hope that temporarily answers the question for now. And I'm sure I can promise on behalf of both the mayor and myself that we will keep working on it. So these terms are sort of what we like to call the advanced honors 101, 201 sort of vocabulary that is harder for folks to wrap their heads around than even diversity, equity, and inclusion, right? And folks think they understand identity, right? We all have different identities. I identify as a woman, 1.5 generation Asian American, grew up lower working class, now pretty staunchly upper middle class. And so these different kinds of identities we have, it's important to know that they change in terms of how we prioritize or hierarchize them depending on what contexts we're in, right? So if I'm in a city hall meeting with Mayor Locke Dawson and we're having a conversation and I throw out an idea and no one says anything, and then 10 minutes later an older white male city leader says the same idea and everybody applauds and rewards him for the idea. You could say, well, there's some sort of, there's some power dynamics and bias and dismissiveness going on in that situation. If then Mayor Locke Dawson intervenes and says, oh yeah, that's a great idea. I think I heard Mariam say it 10 minutes ago also, right? Then she is reattributing some power and authority back to the different power dynamics that have reshifted the identity power dynamics in that space, right? And those differing contexts are about positionality, so that at any given time, our identities have different value attached to them, right? And W.E.B. Du Bois has talked about this. He was talking about in the 18th, 19th century Black folks, but he was talking about this double veil of consciousness, that when Black folks are speaking to others, they have to negotiate what they want to say and communicate with, then what others are projecting onto them there with all the stereotypes about Blackness and Black folks. And then the negotiation that you have to do in that moment of communication, right? And today that kind of double veil of consciousness affects all of us. We all choose our words carefully, and cancel culture and all of that. We all are careful not to offend one another and such. And so that kind of positionality is very important. The more aware you are of the power dynamics in any given space can affect the outcome of that, the goals of that communication, right? And so that's really what positionality is about. And intersectionality is more complicated. And most people think it just means, oh, well, we all have different intersecting identities, and that's great. We all have layered identities, and that's true. But it's a term that comes out of critical race theory and critical legal scholarship. The mother of intersectionality is a professor at UCLA named Kimberly Crenshaw, and I'm going to show you a short video of her talking about it.
There's a case I'd like to talk about. It's a favorite because it makes so many things abundantly clear. There was a group of Black women in the 70s. They sued General Motors. Like many companies, General Motors practiced race and sex discrimination in hiring. They had women's jobs, they had Black jobs. The women's jobs were for secretarial and office work. The Black jobs were the dirty ones on the floor. The catch for Black women is that the women's jobs weren't for Blacks, and the Black jobs weren't for women. Thus, Black women weren't hired. So what did they do? Well, what do we expect them to do? They sued. They claimed race and gender discrimination. Isn't it obvious that these women were discriminated against on the basis of race and gender? Well, it wasn't so obvious to the court hearing the case. To this court, they weren't able to prove their claim. Now, why were they not able to prove their claim? Well, this is interesting logic. Hang on here. So the first thing the court asked was, is there race discrimination? Well, General Motors obviously hired Black men, so there wasn't race discrimination. Then they asked, was there gender discrimination? Well, General Motors obviously hired women, so there wasn't gender discrimination. The court said they were making a specious claim. They were making it up. But there's more. Not only that, the court said if we were to let you make a special claim combining race and gender discrimination, then you would be this super class. You would get something that no one else gets. You get to combine claims, right? So you would get special treatment. You'd be privileged. And of course, we can't have that. This is all about equality. So they got kicked out of court and insulted to boot. It's intersectional discrimination. Let me show you a metaphor that might help us figure out what's going on. When I say intersectionality, I'm being quite literal. I'm referring to the idea that racism, sexism, classism, homophobia, ableism, ageism, they're like deep grooves in our society. They're like the axes that crisscross our culture. If you think of it as roads traveling north to south, east to west, and the traffic is the discrimination, the things that come rolling through. So as anybody knows who has pets who live by a highway, it's a dangerous place to live, to be near a highway or near an intersection where there's a lot of traffic. Some people live in intersections. So naturally, traffic is going to come along that's going to hit them. Now, that's just the first part of intersectionality. That's what happened to the Dragon Reed women. They were Black women. They were hit by race and gender discrimination. That's structural intersectionality, but there's more. So let's suppose you are in this intersection. Let's suppose that the traffic comes along and hits you, right? And let's suppose that you think, well, look, I've got insurance. I've got insurance against race discrimination. I've got insurance against gender discrimination. Surely an ambulance is going to come and pick me up out of the intersection. Surely that's what the DeGraff and Reed women thought when they went to court. Surely we're protected against this. Well, what happened when the ambulances came? Well, they came and they dickered and they dithered about, well, is this your problem? Is this your problem? It's not my problem, it must be your problem. What did they end up doing? They got in the ambulance and drove away. So that's the second aspect of intersectionality, the failure of movements, of interventions, of strategies of reform to deal with those marginalized cases of racism and sexism because they don't look familiar. It doesn't look like anything people realize. So it's political intersectionality, women being marginalized by the very movements that claim them as part of their constituency.
Yeah, I wanted to end there because, and actually it is so appropriate to the question that the participant asked earlier about how can our city and county and down really intervene in structural forms of inequality, right? And so you saw from that video that, you know, the first moment of discrimination can be perpetuated based on the lack of response or intervention. And so this affects all of our systems. It's not just city processes and policies and such. It's all of our own workplace institutions. It's our schools. It's our criminal justice system, right? And so all of us have a lot of work to do in all of these arenas. And it's important to know that, you know, that's one thing to profess your own philosophical values and beliefs and sign on to an anti-racism statement. It's another thing to use language that reflects those principles. And we don't always catch the ways in which our language betrays the opposite of our beliefs, right? And then it's important to then concretize those beliefs and values and language, like gender inclusive language, gender non-binary language, into our policies, processes, and procedures. I'm gonna go back a few to finish out the vocabulary. So that's intersectionality in a nutshell. Were there Q&A questions, Joseph and Nancy? Did you want me to pause?
We don't have any questions at the moment.
Okay, I'll go on. Feel free to interject whenever we do. So privilege and fragility, the next two terms, are things I'm sure you've all heard of late being thrown around in very accusatory manner. Oh, you have white privilege. Oh, you have male privilege. Or, oh, that's a classic example of white fragility. Oh, no more white tears, right? And so these terms have become very charged, but at heart, they're meant to point out certain kinds of invisibility and performances, right? And so when people call out privilege, I should also mention, you know, there's now an attempt to think about, instead of the call out, which is usually very confrontational, right? Doing a kind of call in approach where you point out someone's problematic statements or behavior, but in a way that brings them into wanting to do better, as opposed to kind of in that accusatory fashion, right? And of course, that's very hard to do when you're somebody who's yet offended again for the fifth time that day, right, by some sort of microaggression or very racist intinged undergirded statement, right? And so it's hard to exercise that level of patience and generosity in trying to not be accusatory and calling in gently, right? But the more we can do that, the more we will build the sort of critical mass in terms of fighting for the cause and allyship and co-conspiratorship and such. And so when you're trying to call out or call in forms of privilege, the folks on the receiving end need to also not be defensive about it and acknowledge that, oh, they're pointing out privilege as some sort of blindness or not having had to think about something because I grew up having this advantage, or didn't realize, you know, my whiteness allowed me into spaces comfortably that it might not have allowed other people to enter comfortably, or I don't get surveilled when I'm walking around the mall in my sweats, right? And so for those who do get the call out or call in, it's very important to not get defensive, get sensitive, as if the accusation was somehow about a moral, ethical deficiency on your part, right? That often people over personalize the call out to be some moral wound against their personhood, right? So when somebody says, oh, you know, that statement you made has sort of racist connotations, that doesn't mean they're saying you're racist. But people often, that's all they hear. And then they immediately go into defensive mode and start saying, no, that's not what I intended. You're misappropriating, you're distorting what I said. You're overly sensitive. You've defamed me, right? And then the tears start. And then all of a sudden everyone is comforting the person who did the offense to begin with. And the person who was originally harmed is now in a recurrently sort of disadvantaged position for now having seemed like they wounded the offending party, right? And so the lack of understanding of privilege, the blindness to it, also enables this kind of fragility, right? And everybody has vulnerabilities, right? And we all have different kinds of vulnerability. And there are real socioeconomic, political vulnerabilities, right? And so the term precarity or precariousness actually comes out of labor studies and economic studies around, for example, different labor classes that are temporal, right? Like migrant farm workers have very precarious livelihoods because the seasons change. If there's global warming, if there's not enough water in one season, there are no crops to tend to. They have to migrate to another location up and down the West Coast and East Coast, right? All the orchards and such, and that affects their entire family's livelihood. That is real socioeconomic precariousness and vulnerability, right? The difference between, or you can think of it as gig economies today, all those folks driving Ubers and Lyfts and such, precarious livelihoods, right? Fragility is a performance of vulnerability that could be put on like a coat and a cloak and removed. And that's the problem with it, right? It's a kind of feigning of victimization or vulnerability. And so, what it does is actually deflect or detract away from other socioeconomic, political, concrete, material forms of vulnerability. And this is why people will use the phrase white fragility, because I guess one of the more recent classic examples is the woman in Central Park who was walking her dog without the leash, if you'll recall, and she happened to be a white woman, and there was an African-American gentleman nearby that asked her to leash her dog, and she wouldn't, and she instead called the police on him, the Black man, saying that he was threatening her. And so in that moment, what she did was perform fragility and then called the cops on a Black man, putting him in a position of very historically real political, physical vulnerability, right? Given the relations we know with Black Lives Matter and history, right? And so that's the difference between fragility and precarity. Any questions about that?
Not at this time, Mariam.
Okay, thank you, Nancy. I'm going to then move on to the other moment that is often difficult with civility and having these difficult conversations is when somebody makes a statement like, you're reviewing some policy together and one person says, you know, this language right here, I'm worried it lends itself to sort of racist underpinnings about immigrants, right? And then somebody else who felt like they were part of the drafting of the document will say, I don't think that's appropriate for you to call anybody in this room racist. None of us are racist, and I'm offended by your accusation, right? So the inability to recognize what the first individual was trying to call attention to in the language as possibly perpetuating systemic institutional forms of racism or anti-immigrant politics, right, gets somehow over-personalized to being a personal wound or critique of that person's writing skills or drafting, as if they are accusing the author of being racist or anti-immigrant themselves, right? And that often happens because individuals have a hard time differentiating between individual forms of discrimination that you can do when you do make a racist or sexist statement, right? Versus when individuals state things or behave in ways that are not overtly or clearly offensive or discriminatory in themselves, but they may perpetuate or be embedded in a much longer, deeper history of policies, practices, procedures of institutions and belief systems, right? That then perpetuate different inequalities. So for example, you know, in the US, we often do blessings in before ceremonies, or we often say, in God we trust, or, you know, we're not thinking about it as, oh, well, privileging one particular God over different other belief systems is inequitable in some ways, right? I know the mayor has had to have these conversations with the Multicultural Forum on what kinds of welcoming statements we make at the beginning of events and stuff. And so this is, you know, This often causes the most friction, though, because when people do call attention to problematic statements, people will conflate the accusation as an individual attack versus an attempt to point out institutional and systemic forms of discrimination. So now we're going to move to bias, implicit unconscious bias, and microaggressions.
Our brain is hardwired to trust what's familiar and be suspicious of what's unfamiliar. It's a basic survival instinct that's helped keep us safe for thousands of years.
We unconsciously sort things into familiar versus unfamiliar, same versus different, them versus us. Here's a test. How do you feel about people who own a handgun,
Don't attend church. Vote for the other candidate.
are on welfare,
Don't eat meat.
have tattoos,
Don't believe in marriage.
drive an electric car,
Didn't go to college.
don't speak English,
Curse.
Are over 60.
are disabled,
Drive the speed limit.
Love cats.
love dogs? Can you feel your brain sorting people into groups? Was there a little them versus us happening? It can happen unconsciously.
One more brief video.
In Lesson 1, we learned that schemas apply to people. Without any conscious thought, the instant we see someone, we assign them to salient and chronically accessible social categories, such as age, gender, race, or profession. Once we tag someone as belonging to a particular group, our brain automatically activates a cloud of information that we've come to associate with that group. These associations then potentially influence how we think about and interact with that person. This cloud of associations includes what social psychologists call attitudes and stereotypes. An attitude is an association between a category and an evaluative valence, either positive or negative. Attitudes are like gut feelings, a general like versus dislike, hot versus cold, thumbs up or thumbs down. We hold attitudes about all sorts of things. For instance, you might have a negative attitude toward large rats, but a positive attitude toward plump hamsters. A stereotype, in contrast, is a more specific association between a category and a particular trait. When you think of the category snakes, you probably think of the trait venomous. We know that not all snakes inject toxins when they bite, but there's a strong association nevertheless. Stereotypes also apply to people. Some groups are considered athletic, whereas others are assumed to be good at math. Some groups are seen as natural leaders, whereas others are seen as natural caregivers. Take me, for example. When you see my face or read my last name, your brain hashtags me as Asian, and the attitudes and stereotypes you associate with that category are automatically activated. If you have a positive attitude toward Asians, you might smile at me just a little bit more when I approach you at a lunch table. If you think Asians are good at math, you might be a little more inclined to hire me as your accountant, but not your lawyer. If you think Asians aren't athletic, you probably won't choose me for your pickup game of basketball. We call attitudes and stereotypes biases because they represent information that diverges from some neutral point. Explicit biases are attitudes and stereotypes that you know you have because you can just ask yourself what your feelings and thoughts are and get an answer. By contrast, an implicit bias is an attitude or stereotype that you have no direct introspective access to. In other words, asking yourself for an honest answer doesn't tell you what you need to know. Where do these biases come from? Why do we associate certain attitudes and stereotypes with some groups but not others? Well, think about how you learned that snakes are venomous. Or think about why certain smells or foods give you a warm feeling of home. It's through exposure in a particular context. Sometimes that exposure is through direct contact. Other times it's through secondhand or vicarious contact, mediated through stories, books, movies, social media, and popular culture. It's no different with people. Pause for a moment and think about your attitude toward Native Americans. Also, what traits do you associate with them? How did you learn all this? Was it through direct interaction? If it was more vicarious, how accurate and representative do you think those exposures were? Because we are aware of explicit bias, we're often mindful about checking them for accuracy, appropriateness, and fairness. Most of us actually strive to revise our prior attitudes and stereotypes on the basis of better information. But this sort of self-correction doesn't go on with implicit bias because we don't even know we have them. Unfortunately, there's increasing evidence that implicit biases, even though they operate invisibly, influence our actions and decisions in small but consequential ways. Still curious?
So it's important to know that, bias comes not just in sort of subconscious level behavior, right? But in the language we use also, we often betray forms of bias. So often women get applied adjectives like, oh, helpful, so collaborative, friendly, and supportive and compassionate, right? Where very communal language. Whereas men get applied adjectives like, oh, he's so visionary and innovative and entrepreneurial. And what happens, what the danger of these biases when they go unchecked is that they turn into decisions, formal, concrete decision making, right? So, oh, she's so helpful. Let's have her plan all of the department parties for the rest of the year. Oh, he's so visionary. Why doesn't he become the next mayor or the next department chair, right? And so you can see how those subconscious biases play out into very real decision making actions, right? And so for example, go ahead.
Dr. Lamb, we do have a question in the chat regarding the last slide. Is preferential privilege, which is the cause of discrimination, something not to be discussed?
No, I think the preferential privilege is a form of bias, right? It's the prioritizing or privileging of one class or identity over another. I think they're all flip sides of the same conversation. Thank you. So for example, in this statement, we want individuals to have all of these great characteristics, right? But as applied to a man, somebody might, in a search committee hiring scenario, say, oh, he's not afraid to fight for what he believes is right for the organization. And his fearless fighting, challenging of the status quo has led to big payoffs for his team. And then as applied to a woman, they might say, oh, she's got a very direct, no nonsense communication style. Which at that point still sounds good, right? Like fearless challenging of the status quo. But then all of a sudden that has not been embraced by her peers. So all of a sudden the tone changes and the same characteristic gets treated as, oh, she's like a difficult woman. Oh, she's challenging. Oh, she's bitchy, right? All these kinds of terms you hear for assertive about assertive women versus the same characteristic assertiveness in men. And so it's important to recognize these sort of subtle forms in which we betray our biases. And then there are often assumptions made about international folks, right? That, oh, somehow they come from much more homogenous cultures. Oh, they don't understand sexism or racism in their countries. Oh, they're Black, as in Blackness means the same thing for the whole continent of Africa and the Caribbean and the Maghreb, right? And the West Indies and all of that. Or Asian, assuming that there's some sort of commonality that doesn't include sort of the understanding of diversity politics that we might have in the US. And then there's this competitive notion of global diversity versus national diversity, or domestic. But if you look at the statistics and the breakdown of, say, who do we hire internationally versus who do we hire domestically, you'll find that it's the same breakdown where we often hire European white folks and Asian folks and South Asia and East Asia. And it's the same as the US. So you're not hiring as much from all the Latin American countries, African countries, and global indigenous spaces. So it's surprising how similar the challenges are. And other acculturation politics with the different legislation, how, threatening and anxiety producing things like legal status can be, even before COVID conditions, right? Travel pressures. If you're the only one that's managed to go abroad for your education and you're supporting your entire family back home, right? All of these things are very precarious to those individuals. It's important to know that we all have biases. They're pervasive. I, as a woman of color, can be just as racist and sexist as homophobic as the next person. And that as the social psychological studies show that all of us, our moral, ethical self-perception of ourselves is always far greater than our words and behavior will actually evidence. So we all think we're good people, right? We all don't intend to do harm. And so this often blinds us to the kinds of false steps that we do make. And so it's also important to know that our biases are malleable over time. If somebody keeps calling attention to the fact that, have you noticed you keep using this ableist language? Like you keep saying, oh, that's so lame, or, oh, she's crazy, or, oh, you know, if you keep getting called out on the same kind of language, you might make a mental note, oh, that's an area I need to work on, right? Video game designers these days are trying to intervene in unconscious bias by counterintuitive or counter stereotype moves, right? Don't shoot that Black person in the video game who has his hand in his pocket, right? That you don't get points for that, right? And so you can see how different industries are attempting to try to intervene at different levels. And the reason why it's really important to talk about microaggressions and implicit bias and all of these challenges to civility is that the Center for Disease Control actually says the leading cause of death in the US is not drunk driving. It's not all these other things we might think it is. It is secondary health illnesses stemming from workplace anxiety and stress. And so the more we can create and support and sustain psychological safety in our spaces, in our workplace, and really think about the whole employee, the whole person, your whole colleague as a being, right, with emotions and such, and not to coddle them, but to really take into consideration their anxieties and their stress level, and what can we do as a workplace to improve that, the effects, right, those stress, the more we'll be able to improve our entire community's emotional well-being and psychological safety. The problem with implicit biases or unconscious biases is when they become microaggressions, right? We actually weaponize them against one another. And we hear, you know, resistant folks on our campus, usually it's more senior faculty who just believe that, oh, microaggressions are, you know, there are these made up terms these days. They're nothing more than old school jokes and slights that people are just precious snowflakes these days. They're overly sensitive. We're coddling our kids today. And that's actually just factually, definitionally incorrect. That's not what a microaggression is. A microaggression is, whether intentional or unintentional, slights, snubs, insults that actually target particular identity categories, right? And the micro in microaggressions, micro invalidations and such is not micro because it's any less harmful or hurtful or discriminatory or offensive. It's micro because they often happen in smaller interpersonal situations where it's more awkward to call it out, because it may be amongst coworkers, it may be amongst somebody you've known for a very long time and you're afraid to call it up because it'll make your relationship awkward. It's your church group member, it's your writing group member, right? And so then people let it go, but the bitterness lingers and the resentment grows. And so we do want to talk about it in the moments in which it happens, right? And so the difference between what those misperceptions of what a microaggression is if I go up to Muhammad one day and I say, oh, Muhammad, you didn't manscape today, your facial hair is a mess. That may or may not be a funny joke to Muhammad and all of the people around us who heard me say it. If I go to Muhammad again next week and I say, Muhammad, you're dressed like a terrorist today. And then the week after that, I go up to Muhammad and say, Muhammad, gas prices are through the roof. Your people must be making out like bandits. Now I am clearly targeting my perceived identity category that I've applied and projected onto Muhammad, and I'm repeatedly harassing him, right? These kinds of jokes, whether they were intended to be hurtful or not, are microaggressions because they're making Muhammad incredibly uncomfortable, not to mention everybody else witnessing that and not knowing how to address it. So these are additional examples of microaggressions you may have heard. And it's important to know straight white men might be microaggressed against as well, right? This lower right-hand corner one. Wait, you're gonna stay home with the baby? Are you really gonna let your wife wear the pants in the relationship, right? That is implicit bias around gender politics and who should wear the pants and bring home the bacon, and these very, old school ways of thinking about power dynamics in the household and such, right? How do you think that's gonna make him feel, right? I had an administrator come up to me and say, what's wrong with assuming somebody's from Canada? Not understanding that the problem with being surprised by somebody wearing a hijab could be a native born Canadian or North American is the assumption and the microaggression, right? That somehow this woman is a perpetual foreigner and can never be more Canadian than the next person.
Dr. Lamb, we have another question.
Okay.
This is the perfect topic to mention that people in other countries appreciate foreigners trying to speak the local language. On the contrary, many people born here were raised with English language and seem to wonder why people from other countries cannot speak English if they speak with their accent. Any thought?
Yeah, that's true. And we know there are all kinds of biases against people with accents who may be super genius in their fields, but they get passed over promotions because of their accents and such, right? And for example, our teachers, our international scholars and stuff you think they don't know they have thick accents. They actually will over prepare PowerPoint slide presentations that have all the text there so that people can follow along if they're having a hard time understanding through the accents, right? Many people do all kinds of bending over backwards to accommodate for their, perceived challenges. And so we find that intervening in the bias is very hard. So for job interviews, we've had provost searches where people have pointed out, well, those two candidates who had thick accents, their interviews were late in the afternoon where everyone was tired. And that might have kept them from getting on the short list because people just were not really giving them much credit at that point, right? And so everything from your fatigue level can affect your perception. And I have another video I didn't include here, but about bias in hiring practices and how that plays out. And often you tend to go with people who look like you, act like you, and such, your natural affinities, and then you re-piece together. That happens in less than a fifth of a second. And then you piece together facts that back up your prime choice anyway, right? And so another day we could go through all the hiring practice stuff. But yeah, the sort of, also, for example, our students, international students will say that their writing teachers, don't want to put in the work of helping them correct their grammar deficiencies or challenges and such. And then they just let them off easy with their grading. And then that actually affects their ability to improve their English writing skills, right? And so you can see, well-intended or not, the ways in which people address language challenges can perpetuate inequities, right? And actually perpetuate the continued perceptions of accents and such. That's a short answer to the question that could be a much longer conversation. Oh, I do include the hires bias.
As recruiters, we are often confident we get the best person for the job. The person with the best CV, the best skills profile, the right experience. We convince ourselves that we ask the right questions, weigh the evidence, to make a rational decision. However, the scientific research suggests that we add a much less objective set of information into the mix. For example, in 2010, researchers in Sheffield, England, sent out 3,000 CVs for real jobs across cities in the UK. They put a typical white name at the top of 1,000 of the CVs, an Asian name at the top of 1,000, and an African name at the top of 1,000. They were the same CVs, only the names varied. And then they waited to see who got invited for an interview. They found that if you had a white name, you typically waited 9 applications before you got an interview. If you had an Asian or African name, you waited 16 applications on the same CV. The scientific research suggests that this effect is more likely to be unintentional, driven by patterns wired into our unconscious brains and neural pathways rehearsed by our experience and upbringing, but also by the media we absorb. Similar research from Sweden suggests we are likely to sift out people who are overweight, a different ethnical group to us, or if they gained their qualifications in another country. We also seemed hardwired to prefer tall people, particularly tall men, as leaders. We unconsciously see more attractive people as more competent and socially confident, and see names which are familiar or easy to pronounce as more competent. We seem to prefer to be with people who are like us, that look like us, sound like us, share our social background, interests, or education. Brain scans show that we make these rapid, automatic, and unconscious judgments about people in less than a fifth of a second, faster than our eyes can even process the person's face. By the time our thoughtful, objective brain kicks in after about half a second, it is too late to stop these judgments affecting our people decisions. We then simply reshape the facts to justify what our unconscious has already decided. This does not just happen when sifting job applications. After all, we can rarely tell from a CV if someone is overweight. It happens in interviews, at assessment centers, and in the casual conversations we may have with candidates. But we convince ourselves the decision was based on the hard objective evidence. In one research study where male and female names were put on the same CV, not only was the male CV rated as more competent, employable, and likely to respond well to training, but assessors offered a 15% higher starting salary based on the same CV. By letting these unconscious preferences for some types of people, usually people like us, affect our people decisions, we may let the real talent slip through our fingers by fishing from only part of the talent pool and ignore people who are
I wanted to pause on this last image that he drew, because even in a well-intended video like this,
as recruiters, contact Dr.
How
Pete.
do you make it stop? Okay. Even in a well-intended video like this, he falls into stereotypes: the overexcited woman, right, emotional, and then the angry men of color. And so none of us are immune to this, right? The kind of attempts at intervention. And additional barriers for women and underrepresented minorities in all kinds of occupations and such is disparate representation. What Mayor Locke Dawson was saying, she even increased the diversity in her own staff, right, when she got here. We know that it's systemic, the way people get selected and hired. So in the field of physics, out of 199 Nobel laureates, only 2 have been women. Is it because there aren't women physicists? No. Who gets to do the nominations? Who's on the selection committees? Which universities and institutions keep getting tapped, right? It's a much larger structural, institutional, systemic problem. We know that women and underrepresented minorities have all kinds of stereotypes they have to deal with. Our women engineers on campus, the grad students tell me, oh, whenever I go to a conference, I intentionally wear pants or a pantsuit to show that I'm just as authoritative as the other male engineers in the room. And then I have other women engineering students saying, well, I intentionally wear a dress and a skirt to show them that there are more and more women in engineering today. That extra negotiation in the morning when you have to wake up and get dressed is an extra layer of burden that you have to do, right? And so this kind of tightrope of having to appear not too masculine or too feminine, right? Of looking professional, not doing the eye roll if you're a vice presidential candidate when somebody won't let you get a word in. And then this need to feel like you have to be hyper competent to do things 5 times better, 10 times better, just to get the same level of recognition that the next person might get, even without the excellent quality of work, right? We know there's still lack of role models in our various industries and professions that can do the kind of mentoring that we might need. And of course, there's still gender and racial discrimination, sexual harassment, and bias in hiring. And so tips for avoiding bias and microaggressions: do try to avoid jokes and humor that might perpetuate media and stereotypes. I'm notoriously bad at this because I think I'm funny, and I grew up watching, oddly, the Benny Hill show with my father. sorry, I'm dating myself, but so you can slip into these, patterns that you might think or remember thinking was funny and then really offend people, right? And in those moments, you should acknowledge the mistake, apologize, commit to doing better, and then moving on, right? And actually try to do better. You don't have to turn it into this whole defensive, oh my gosh, you've wounded me. I certainly am not sexist, or I certainly am not homophobic, right? Moment, right? If you can just take a moment to receive the critique and let it absorb, right? When we say look for good role models, we don't mean look for the most minoritized person in the room who was just offended to then explain why they're offended and give us a free cultural education lesson. We mean look for the people in the room who are known to be good mediators, who know when to de-escalate a conversation, know how to do it, but know how to not brush it under the carpet, right? But to have a moment of unpacking if things are getting too escalated or heated, knowing when to say, you know what, let's table this conversation, let's do some homework and read up on this, and let's come back to this conversation next month or next week at our next meeting, right? Review your existing policies and procedures, because oftentimes people perpetuate inequalities and discrimination and inequity without meaning to, but they're this outdated policy and process that we still follow from 50 years ago. We're still following it, even though I'm in the Leadership Riverside cohort, and they gave us these guidelines of what to wear or not to wear to when we go to the county jail. And they were so dated. It was like, oh, women should not be wearing low cut necklines and this and that. And I was like, oh, maybe they should put that on the men's guidelines also, right? So they're not intending to be sexist, but using the same policies they've had for 60 years is actually perpetuating the gender discrimination in just something as a guidance policy on what not to wear. So don't be afraid to support your minoritized networks, right? We've had supervisors who didn't want to bring up family leave policies, maternity leave policies, because they don't want to bring up the fact that their employee was a woman and she might need to know that. But then when it came time for her tenure review and she didn't know how to articulate the fact that she had time off and wasn't, producing research and stuff during that time, it actually got her into trouble because she didn't know how to package her materials. So he intended to be good, but it backfired where it actually hurt the person he was trying to support, right? By being afraid to talk about gender and race. So the more we can normalize talking about gender and race and homophobia and ableism and all of that, the more it's less, the less scary it is to actually have these conversations. And don't be resistant to these kinds of workshops and trainings. There are millions of those YouTube videos online. Be vigilant about, challenging yourself and recognizing your own biases and fears. Try to hold others accountable, polite, nice, gentle corrections and the calling in approach is often very good at expanding understanding around you, right? Extending your networks. If you want a second opinion on whether or not what you said was offensive, don't go to your usual go-to people who are probably already in your usual affinity group. Go to others who might have, more challenging feedback or responses. I think we covered the other ones. The difference between an ally and an accomplice or a co-conspirator, often allies see themselves as empathetic people who understand, oh, I'm an LGBT ally. I understand, I can sympathize with what it means to be queer and, trans presenting and have the side eye at you everywhere you go and such. And then people will call out bad allies, right, for making it all about themselves. Oh, I'm such a great ally and it's all about you, and it's actually detracting from the cause. But co-conspiratorship or accompliship is not just being empathetic, it's understanding the systems and mechanisms that keep that identity group in forms of disadvantage and discrimination, and actually trying to chip away at those structural impediments and inequalities, right, and inequities together. So in that sense, you're co-conspiring or being an accomplice in doing the good work of dismantling systemic forms of discrimination and bias. Try to learn your own biases over time. Recognize that, oh, clearly I have particular issues that trigger me. Oh, when everybody mentions bullying, I go into a tunnel vision mode and all I can think about is like critiquing this. Or, oh, I have a real issue with how people define sexual harassment. And then clearly you go into tunnel vision or down a rabbit hole. Well, you keep recognizing that about yourself, know that that particular issue triggers you, and then start recognizing your own forms of fragility and your own forms of privilege, right? And the more comfortable you are calling out your own weaknesses and things you've had to overcome yourself, the more you make it normal and okay for others to have a growth mindset versus a fixed mindset, right? Which is when people with fixed mindsets think if you failed at something or if you got a low score on something, that you failed. And failure is really an opportunity for learning, right? You're going to do better next time. And so people with fixed mindsets don't see things in black and white or failure and success. They see them all as learning opportunities and moments of growth. And then psychological safety is really important, right? In terms of what it means to be in a community together, to be communing together, and really replacing moments of fear and anxiety and discomfort with real feelings of respect and permission, right? Permission to say that awkward thing that could be not stated politically correct, but trying to figure out what would be the appropriate way to say something, right? Without feeling embarrassed or afraid that you will be punished or retaliated against by your supervisor for calling attention to something you're recognizing in the office that might not be very equitable, right? And so respect, permission, trust, all of these things play a huge role in civility and creating the kind of psychological safety we want in our environments. I think for the purposes of time, I'm going to move through some of these, but more slides on how can you improve psychological safety, right? The more psychological safety you have in an environment, in a space, the more innovation you'll actually have, and the more your team members and community will succeed and thrive together because people feel like everyone's really behind them and that you're working collectively and in solidarity, right? And it actually, over time, people realize that it actually boosts employee engagement as opposed to employee disengagement and apathy, right? And it improves the quality of the work productivity. So things to recognize if to see that you may be dealing with some psychological harm in your space. People suddenly withdrawing and less communication over time, right? I think I'm going to skip the Brene Brown video for you. And then these are tips at how to, practice better allyship and better co-conspiratorship, which is really thinking about allyship as kind of boots on the ground work and participating in the initiatives that Mayor Dawson mentioned for the city, and really thinking about your own industry. If you work in Riverside Public Utilities, if you work in our religious organizations, like what can you do in your own space and institution and industry to improve those conditions, right? Tips for how to deal with bullies, like have a script prepared, bring a third party with you, right? We have to do a lot of these tips on active bystander intervention, encouraging when to be a good bystander. Sometimes a good bystander knows this is not the time to do something, but even checking on that individual after, hey, that was awful. How do you feel? Are you okay? How about if I contact the supervisor? So that, letting even just that kind of empathy goes a long way too in terms of allyship. But then thinking through, what should I have done that was clearly wrong? Should I go and report something as a witness, right? People have been saying just appalled at the different kinds of lack of bystander intervention around all the anti-Asian and anti-Black violence we've been seeing, right? And so, Oprah Winfrey did a special like 20 years ago about bystanders not doing intervening and such. And so I think there's a current climate change in attempting to get more bystander intervention, but it's something in DEI work we've been trying to push for quite a long time. And then working harder to practice more inclusive language, avoid psychologizing language, you know, these notions like, oh, she's crazy, oh, that's schizo, that's bipolar. You know, we really have folks around us who have invisible or less visible disabilities, and it's very alienating and causes a lot of psychological harm for people to throw around these terms so loosely as jokes and such when they're really struggling with bipolar depression and anxiety and having to take all kinds of drugs and feeling out of it because of the drugs, and then trying to decide when not to take the drugs and such. And so really being much more sensitive and conscientious about our ableist language is important. Trans inclusive language, right? Tips when you slip up, ask in advance, right? Supporting gender inclusive bathrooms and stuff. You all know we're under the California Gender Recognition Act as of January 2019. We should all have gender inclusive bathroom options and gender non-binary pronoun options in our documents and such. Use person first language, like persons with disability as opposed to disabled folks. And then really just generally trying to reach a higher standard. These are resources on our diversity.ucr.edu website should you want to go for more information. There's some really great videos. This Microaggressions in the Classroom one is an 18-minute video, and I'm usually bawling by the end of the video seeing what students go through in the classroom. And then our chancellor we led a campus culture, really climate task force for about 6 months and came up with a lot of recommendations on how to improve the climates in all of our units on campus. And so feel free to look at that report on the website because it might have tips for your own divisions and occupations and such. And then what's also helpful for creating more psychological safety is to have some sort of anonymous reporting mechanism so that folks who are afraid of retaliation could still report the incident by creating a Gmail account that's unidentifiable so that you could still circle back with them and let them know what you were able to do. But we found that having anonymous reporting mechanisms are very important for creating more confidence in the institution's willingness to address the concerns and be more accountable. So this is my contact information. Here's my cell number if you have emergency situations you need advice on. But my wonderful project manager, Tasha Hudson, can help you if you want to schedule meetings and such with me. So that's it. I'm going to stop sharing now so I can see all your faces.
We do have one last question for you. What do you recommend that we as individuals can do to best promote diversity, equity, and inclusion in the community?
I think there's so many things you can do. I mean, everything from participating in your community, right, in different levels of engagement, whether it's just joining your, church, temple, mosque potluck, right, or there's the kind of very multi-culty 90s version of cultural diversity, and we're a colorful tapestry, right, melting pots, mixed salad bowl interactions, right, which is a very lighthearted way to get to know and have that exposure to diverse communities, right? And then there's the more systemic things you can do, intervene and try to, if you are active in our, Black parents group that really is pushing for equity and such in our school systems for our Black kids and youth, right? And college students and stuff, participate in that. If you're invested in diversifying scientists, STEM education and such, a volunteer to do stuff in the school districts and stuff. If you're, I think there's so many different levels of engagement, and today, that you can, I'm sure, easily find things that you can do.
I do have I think it's a comment actually, like participating in the MLK walk in January of 2022.
Yep. Hi, Earl. Thanks. Good tip.
Yes. I do have a comment for myself, actually. I found it interesting because, of course, having to do all the research for civility, one of the things was you're not practicing civility correctly if you surround yourselves with people of like minds and like images. It's when you when you get diversity in there, then you can truly practice civility with other people. I thought that was interesting, and you talked about that, especially in the recruitment and hiring section.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's why civility is easier, right? Civility is relative for certain communities. If you're amongst all very similar ethnic and gender identity as well as cultural upbringing, you're not going to be very uncivil towards one another because you're used to the same mores and language patterns and jokes and stuff. If then you come in contact with a different community or cultural background and such, there are going to be differences of behavior and treatment, and what one might perceive as incivility or disrespectful. Another community is like, oh no, my whole family is loud. We scream at each other across the dinner table. That's normal, the raised, elevated voices, right? And so it's really important to have that humility, right, and cultural openness and generosity when we encounter any kind of difference, right? I think the worst possible reaction to any kind of difference you can have is that somehow you're judging that difference. Difference means, oh, that's wrong. I'm right. My way is the right way. That's inferior, right? As opposed to taking the time to understand that difference, right? So you all hear of those studies where early on they had Asian employees with Western white employers, and the Asian people would never look at the employer in the eye, and for the Asian folks that was like a sign of respect, but for the employer they were like, oh, they're not confident, they're not going to be able to lead this organization, they're shifty, I can't trust them, they don't look me in the eye, right? And so all these judgment values placed on just differences that we haven't taken the time to understand and unpack yet. So at any moment of cultural contact or difference, that's when you need to slow down and be as generous and giving and charitable as possible in the interaction.
Let's see. Okay, does anyone else have any questions? We'll give it a couple seconds. Let's see. Okay, I think that's going to be it for tonight.
Well,
so it was an amazing presentation. I truly enjoyed it. It was very insightful. So okay. Well, I want to thank everyone for participating in today's event. As you'll see in the chat, there is a few links for some next events that are coming up. Our next speaker will be from Johns Hopkins Civility Project. Also at the top, you'll see a Survey Monkey. This is a survey from the Center for Books. If you fill that out, that would be very much appreciated, that information, and they allow us to do programs like this. Well, so if you have any questions or concerns, my contact information is listed below. So with that, I want to take this opportunity to thank Mariam for giving us this amazing presentation. And I also want to thank Mayor Locke Dawson for coming in and participating with us as well. I want to thank, of course, Nancy and Scott, who helped produce this program behind the scenes. And I also want to thank everyone who was here participating in today's event. We do truly appreciate it, and we do hope to see you for future events. With that, I hope everyone has a good evening. Goodbye, everyone.